Thanks very much indeed, Sue, and thanks very much to Vicky and the team at the studios for organising this evening's event and for creating the opportunity to share a few of the reflections that emerged during the course of writing this, What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? As Sue said, I've been around the environment, conservation, sustainability theme for actually quite a long time, about 30 years. And in fact, it will be exactly 30 years this year since I started my first work in this space. And I have to say, looking back over that period, you can see really quite a big change that's taken place. Lots of new laws are in different parts of the world, including at the global level with the Biodiversity Convention. We've had action on climate change through legislation. We've seen the challenge of acid rain being brought more under control, global initiatives to help protect the ozone layer, different parts of the world enacting legislation to protect species and natural habitats. And so you see this progression going on over that 30 years until quite recently when we saw the economic downturn and we saw quite a lot of what was being achieved not only come to a standstill but to go into reverse. And this is really the big message this evening, is about the environment not being really a series of fluffy green questions. These are hard economic issues, which at the moment are being massively misunderstood by politicians in all parts of the world. And if we are going to do what we need to do to conserve nature, to stabilize climate change, to look after natural resources, this is one of the big things we have to flip. We have to stop the misperception that nature is a blockage to development, a barrier to job creation, and a way of harming countries' competitiveness, and get it into the place which is the reality, whereby we see nature as an essential set of services which underpin economic well-being. And so this is really about flipping the mindset. We can continue to do small things, and those small things will be helpful in terms of policies and laws to do particular jobs. But until we realise that actually the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of ecology, we won't do what we need to be doing. And so that's the message of this book, and I base it on a great deal of evidence, on interviews with experts, on things that I've seen myself over many years of environmental campaigning. And I start the story really right beneath our feet in what is perhaps the most underappreciated subsystem of planet Earth's natural functioning organs, the soil. Now, soil in many parts of the world has the cultural label of dirt. It's something you sweep away, you concrete over, you put gravel on, you wash it off, because it's something that's undesirable. And yet, that little piece of living fabric, in most places about that deep, is actually one of the most dynamic and essential systems in the entire Earth ecology. And if you look at what it's doing, obviously the most important thing that we see in an immediate sense is growing food. But there's a whole lot of other things going on in that little thin layer between the atmosphere and the rock beneath. One of the stories that really underlined to me the multiple functions of soil comes from a trip to a place near to where I live in East Anglia in Cambridgeshire, in a place called Holme Fen. If you go up to Holme Fen, you'll see one of the last fragments of a great big wetland that used to stretch from Cambridge right up to the Wash and the North Sea. And in that area of wetland, over the 8,000 years since the end of the last ice age, this great body of peat accumulated. So that's stuff you buy in the garden centre that you grow your plants in. It's basically unrotted plant remains, and it remains as unrotted plant remains as long as it stays wet. During the 1850s, big drainage works were installed in this part of Cambridgeshire in order to open up the soil for agriculture, that thing that we find so important for food production, we farm. The land was turned over to that function, but as the land was turned over to that function, the soil, doing another very important job, suddenly changed and stopped doing that particular function. And you can see this at a place where the drainage works going ahead in 1852 were accompanied by what's turned out to be a really quite fascinating environmental monitoring project. Because a local landowner up there called William Wells, as the peat began to be drained, or great big ditches being put in, he imported a great steel girder from the Great Exhibition in London that had taken place the year before, took it up to Cambridgeshire, and he forced it through the peat down into the marine clay beneath and fixed it there into the clay. Now, what he did was to fix the top of the steel post at ground level in 1852. If you go up there today, the steel post has not moved, But unfortunately, the land has. And now, if you walk by that post, the top of it is 4 meters above ground level. And what that denotes is basically the disappearance of 4 meters of ground right across the whole of that part of East Anglia, several hundred square kilometers. Now, what happened is that once the water was removed from the land in order to open up for agriculture, the peat did shrink a bit. But the more important reason why there's now 4 meters of steel post sticking up is because the material that was in the peat was basically comprised of 2 substances, water and carbon, the unrotted plant remains being principally carbon. You take away the water and the carbon is exposed to the air where it unites with oxygen molecules and it turns into carbon dioxide. That land has literally turned into thin air. Hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide are now in the atmosphere as a result of that drainage, compared to the situation before when the soil was holding that carbon locked fast in that underground store. And this goes for soils right across the world. Because of the way we're farming, we're expelling organic matter. That's the unrotted plant remains that exist in most soils. We're depleting the proportion of that to the detriment of global climate stability. This is a very interesting fact when you consider how much argument goes on in countries these days around the role of solar power, the subsidies we need for wind power, the relative merits of nuclear power. Nobody talks about soils, and yet there's more carbon locked up in the world's soils than there is in all of the forests and the atmosphere combined. That's really quite an important fact when we look at the multiple uses of this particular subsystem of the Earth in terms of how we're going to meet our future needs. One of the things I would say we need to be doing is to be looking at the economics of agriculture and thinking about the sense of expelling all that CO2 in order to produce food in what is a really short-term and quite destructive way. Because not only are we expelling carbon into the atmosphere, we're also destroying soils, which in the end are the basis of our food security. And if you look at some of the estimates produced by the United Nations Environment Programme, they will tell you that something like 1/3 of agricultural soils worldwide have been degraded or damaged in some way since the middle of the 20th century. And those peatland soils in East Anglia are among them. Sometimes you think of this as a third world issue. It's not. It's everywhere that we're causing this kind of damage, in the process contributing to not only food insecurity but also climate change. And at the same time as we're doing these degradation of important services, there's another whole layer that's in there that we're not even really aware of, and it stems back to the fact of taking a tablespoonful of agricultural soil from a healthy part of the English farming areas, take it into a lab, start to look at the microorganisms in that 1 tablespoon sample. If you've got the patience to sit there with an electron microscope for long enough, you will find something like 6 billion individual microorganisms, mostly bacteria, some viruses, some actinobacteria, some fungi, nematodes. And of those 6 billion individual organisms, you'll find something like 20,000 different species. That's in a sample about that big. So that level of interaction underlines a massive complexity going on down there, because this system has been evolving for about 3 billion years, literally. And as a result of that, we have this incredible body of biological knowledge held in soil systems. And that body of biological knowledge is based upon an arms race that's been going on for hundreds of millions of years between different kinds of organisms in different kinds of relationships, predator-prey, host and parasite. And in order to win in the battle for survival, these organisms have innovated in different ways to be able to, for example, ward off attack by other organisms. And there's a group called the actinobacteria that have invented some really quite special chemicals to be able to withstand biological infection. And any of you who've ever had an antibiotic medicine will have benefited from this particular trick that's been honed in soils for many, many millions of years, because this is where all of our clinically useful antibiotics have come from. They were invented first by soil organisms trying to ward off attack from other soil organisms in that incredibly complicated ecosystem which we brush off and wipe off and call dirt. It's an incredibly dynamic system that is supporting the most biodiverse subsystem of the Earth at the same time as holding all this carbon and producing our food. And all that biodiversity, of course, is not just sitting there idly. This is the way in which nutrients get recycled. The bacteria and fungi are breaking down complex materials, re-releasing phosphates, nitrogen, and potassium, amongst other things, and that's how we can keep on producing food. So that bit of biodiversity down there is vital to the functioning of the whole thing, and obviously not just from the point of view of medicines. There's a whole load of other innovations we get from biological variety. Obviously all of our food is coming from creatures that were once wild. Everything you ate today has a wild ancestor, or at least it did do some time ago. And if you speak to some of the people looking at the future of food security in the world at a time of rising population, climate change, degradation of soils, they will tell you that the most important thing we have left to be able to keep ahead of these challenges into the future is that wild biodiversity, the relatives of potatoes, tomatoes, wheat and corn still living in the rangelands, grasslands and forests of the earth, because that genetic diversity is an incredibly powerful treasure trove that we can be using to hone food production as these challenges begin to mount, alongside the medicines, of course, that I've already mentioned. And it's not just antibiotics, it's painkillers, anti-cancer drugs, heart treatments, all the rest of it. An incredible body of material and resources that obviously is underpinning global economic security, as well as in these practical ways for medicine and food. And indeed, one estimate looking at the US pharmaceutical market, worth about $650 billion per year, about 25% of that is based upon organisms that are wild or were once wild, which provided the initial inspiration for the different drugs that are now on the market. A huge resource. Obviously, if it's still there, we can continue using it indefinitely into the future. And when you bear in mind how we've only described something like 1.8 million species out of a probable 8.5 million on the Earth, you just realize just how much we've skimmed the surface in terms of understanding the different properties that are out there for future food and medical applications. And then on top of both of those hugely important things for human security is a whole other layer of application that's been emerging in recent years that goes under the heading of biomimicry. This is the process of literally copying nature to solve problems in the human world. And during the course of researching this, I came across many examples. One is the Chrysler Motor Corporation that recently built a new car body design based upon the structure of an animal called the boxfish. And the boxfish has a very rigid skeleton to be able to avoid being predated. And that is a very efficient use of materials, very strong, but using very small amounts of material. So Chrysler were able to make a car body which is stronger and using less steel, which means it's producing less CO2 and demanding less resources to be made. They got that idea from a fish. There are some architects looking at the ways in which termites manage to keep their mounds at a very constant temperature. If you go look at termite mounds in some of the tropical regions, you'll find that if you put a thermometer right inside these big structures you see in the savannah, their temperature varies by only about 1 or 2 degrees during the course of the day. It's 16 to 17 degrees centigrade in there. During the middle of the daytime, it's rocketing up to 28 degrees. At night, the temperature's dropping down to 7 or 8. The termites keep it at 16 or 17, and they do not have a nuclear power station. They do not have a wind turbine even. They're doing it purely by design. Imagine what we could find out for building designs of the future, from where half of our carbon dioxide emissions presently come from. What could we learn from the termites in terms of future building design? Obviously an awful lot. They're doing it with zero energy. It's purely about the ventilation taking place inside the structures they've built. That's something that those animals have learnt through a process of natural selection going back millions of years, as is the snake that I saw in South Australia a couple of years ago being investigated by a researcher there, because this particular snake has also adopted a very interesting energy strategy, because this particular creature, even though right down in the south of Australia it can get very cold in winter with winds blowing up from Antarctica, this animal can remain active really at very low temperatures. And the reason it can do this is because it's found a way of capturing very weak sunshine. It flattens its body and it exposes dark surfaces and it sucks in heat and it retains it and it can go hunting even when it's quite cold. The researchers looking at that particular animal think this might be interesting because it's mastered a trick that would be very helpful at high latitudes for humans in being able to take very weak sunshine in winter for heating technologies. Can we find out how the snake did that? If we can, then perhaps we've got an opportunity to be making some very big leaps in terms of energy efficiency into the future. All of this, of course, the biomimicry, the medical applications, the food security, relies on all these things continuing to exist. And there is a cautionary tale that I tell here about the lost opportunities, really, that come with extinction. And this concerns the story of a couple of animals called the gastric brooding frogs, which invented a very interesting biological trick whereby the adult frogs could host the baby tadpoles inside their stomach. So the adult frogs would lay their eggs, but instead of just leaving them in a pond like frogs would do in this country, the adults swallowed them. And what happened is that the tadpoles developed inside the digestive tract of the adult frog, and when they were just the size of little tiny baby frogs, they come back out and they've avoided the danger period of being a tadpole when you could be eaten by a fish or by a duck or something. So that particular trick was of interest to biologists because they said that by rights, those tadpoles should be digested. They shouldn't be able to survive in there. They should have been taken like any food item and put through the animal's body. But they didn't, and the reason they weren't was because they'd invented some chemical innovation to be able to withstand the impact of the gastric juices. This was of great interest to some physiologists because they thought, well, if the frog has invented a way of protecting those creatures from gastric juices, perhaps there's a clue here in terms of where we might look for cures for peptic ulcers in humans and being able to deal with the misery that many millions of people suffer as a result of this very pernicious gastric disorder. So they went to look for the frogs to find out more about this particular biological trick, and they couldn't find them. And the reason they couldn't find them is because their habitat had been destroyed and both of them had gone extinct. And frogs have obviously taken this particular biological innovation that had taken millions of years to evolve. It had gone to the grave of extinction with them. So there's a cautionary tale in terms of how we might wish to review our relationship with the diversity of life on Earth and to be thinking a little differently about this false choice that's put before us day in, day out. When there's the opportunity to clear a tropical rainforest or to drain a swamp, it has to be done now for economic development and economic growth. If we pause and step back and just think about the practical implications of losing biodiversity at the rate we are now, then perhaps a different policy would be more rational. So some of these things, they're beginning to be understood. You can start to see the value of the medical applications that can be inspired from different bits of biological diversity. Certainly the food side is very clear, and we can see increasingly the case for ecosystem carbon and to be thinking about conserving nature from the point of view of the economic choices we face on the climate issue. There's a whole other level to this, however, beyond the practical things, is about the relationships between different bits of the natural world. And as I'm writing this narrative, I'm beginning to think actually there's a piece here which is not so much about the individual components of nature, but actually much more about the relationships between different bits of it. And I guess in this country at the moment and in some others, the thing that we are hearing most about in terms of this particular point is pollination and the decline of insects that are important for completing the life cycle of different plants. Pollination evolved on the Earth about 140 million years ago. Insects and flowering plants at the time both realized, in inverted commas, that they had a mutual benefit. The plants in being able to move their pollen and the insects in being able to get some food in the process of moving the pollen. And so this is why 95% of the terrestrial higher plants on the Earth today are insect pollinated. They rely on bees, wasps, beetles, moths, hoverflies, butterflies, a few on bats and a few on birds to be able to move pollen between flowers to complete the life cycle. This is an incredibly intricate set of relationships that have evolved over that immense period. And obviously that set of relationships has spilled over into agriculture because 2/3 of the crop plants we rely on worldwide for food security are basically insect pollinated. The ones that are not are the cereals. They're grasses and they're wind pollinated. Rice, barley, maize, wheat. But the fruits, most of the vegetables, these rely on insects. And of course, we're being told to eat more fruits and vegetables. And if we want to carry on doing that, then it's evidently going to be the case that we need to hang on to a very good selection of pollinators to do that. And the more we understand about pollinators, the more we realize that the honeybees that we keep in hives are actually a relatively small part of the equation in terms of what actually gets pollinated in the countryside, including in farms. And if you look at the value of the produce produced with the assistance of insects worldwide each year, it accounts for something like $1 trillion worth of agricultural sales. Now, some very clever ecologists tried to work out the value of those pollinators in an economic sense, and one of the things they did was to try and look at what it would cost to replace those organisms, if you possibly could, in terms of doing the job that they do. And they came to the conclusion that pollinators, and again it's mostly bees, are adding something like $190 billion worth of value to the global economy each year. It's a lot of money. Sounds like rather an abstract amount of cash and really quite a hard thing to get your head around in economic terms until you go to parts of southwestern China. And I talk about this part of Sichuan province in that country where during the 1980s there was a massive use of pesticides in order to be able to kill some of the insects that were damaging the apple and pear crops. The very heavy use of pesticide did help to reduce the damage to the crops, but also at the same time they killed all the bumblebees that were then pollinating the fruit trees. And if you go to that part of China now in the springtime, you'll find entire villages of fruit growers up in the apple and pear trees in March and April with feather dusters moving the pollen between the blossoms by hand because the bees are no longer doing that job for them. And that's when you can start to see the kind of services that are being provided by nature and how you can start to translate some of these into economic values. Because once you start to do that, of course, the discussion changes, because no longer can it be claimed that looking after nature somehow is a block to economic development. Actually, not looking after nature is economically stupid, and that's a very different proposition when you start to look at some of these things in terms of the practical values that are being lost as a result of the development choices that we're taking. So that story, I think, the one of the pollinators, is beginning to get some traction in different parts of the world, and it requires a couple of things to be done that are pretty obvious, but which, require quite a lot of politics to occur before they become reality. One is to start phasing out some of the very nasty pesticides that kill pollinators, and the other thing we have to do is to reverse the destruction of pollinator habitats. Things like bumblebees and hoverflies, they need natural habitats to live in: wetlands, grasslands, woodland edge. We need to start putting some of those back at the same time as phasing out some of the chemicals that we know are killing these organisms. Of course, there's a vested interest here. Companies like Bayer in Syngenta, making some of the chemicals that have been linked recently with bumblebee decline. They'd much rather that politicians didn't ban those substances and that they were kept in the market so that they can continue to make hundreds of billions of pounds worth of profit every year. So it's not only a scientific and rational discussion, this one, it's also about vested interests, which is another dimension of the narrative that I've presented in What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? So that one, the relationship between flowering plants and pollinating insects, is one that's beginning to get a little more traction in public debate. You hear it on the radio here and there. One side of these relationship values that you don't hear about so much is how different bits of the natural world actually protect human health. This is something that I'd not really understood until I started writing this and came across some incredible material that really left me surprised and having to reread stuff several times to make sure I'd actually understood what was going on. Perhaps the most dramatic story in this regard is the one about the values being provided by India's vultures. I went to that country back in the early 1990s, and vultures were very common. There were 3 species of them, about 40 million birds in total. I went back there in the early 2000s and they'd all gone, literally. This was the most rapid decline of any large bird of prey in history. 3 species of vulture now listed as critically endangered when they were amongst the most abundant large birds of prey just a decade before. And this precipitous decline of these birds followed the introduction of a new veterinary drug in India, a drug called diclofenac. It's a very beneficial drug from the point of view of getting sick animals back on their feet. And if you're a poor rural farmer and you want your buffalo to be pulling the plough and he's not very well, a dose of diclofenac really helps to get them back in the game. And so this was a popular drug being used by rural vets in India. What people didn't realize as this stuff was going into widespread use was how it was lethal in tiny quantities to these 3 species of vulture. So if your buffalo died within a week of being injected, there would be sufficient residues in its body to kill these vultures. It caused organ failure. And so if any of you have ever seen vultures feeding, you'll realize that one injected animal in a locality would wipe out the entire population like that. Because once the vultures realize there's a big piece of carrion to eat, they come together and you may see a couple of hundred birds feeding on one carcass. They clean it very quickly, but within a week or 2, all of those birds would be dead. And so this happened right across India to the point where these birds went from 40 million to a few tens of thousands in under a decade. Now, a number of consequences followed that particular dramatic decline in these birds, and one was the fact that they were no longer eating about 12 million tons of meat in the countryside every year. This was the amount of food that these birds were consuming in the form of dead cattle, dead goats, dead buffalo, animals killed by the side of the road. And so obviously this was leaving a lot of stinking flesh lying around, which incurred costs for communities who couldn't any longer rely on the birds to be cleaning up. What people didn't foresee, even at the early stages of this, when the birds were declining, was the effects that would come from so much food being a windfall for other scavengers. And the principal beneficiary of this nutritional windfall left by the vultures was India's wild dog population. As the vultures went down, there was loads of meat left that was not being eaten, and so the wild dog population rocketed upwards by about 7 million animals is the estimate over a period of a few years. Millions more dogs in the countryside meant millions more people being bitten by dogs, which led to an estimated 50,000 additional deaths caused by rabies that wouldn't have occurred had the vultures still been there. And that's a conservative number. Nobody's measured it directly. It's an extrapolation based upon statistical techniques. But that's the conservative number. And the other conservative number that went with the decline of the vultures, and not only because of the public health issues, but also the cleanup and various people losing feedstock for their industries, including people who used to collect the skins and the bones for fertilizer, all that was gone. If you look at all these combined costs, it's estimated that between 1993 and 2003, the loss of vultures in India cost that country in the order of $35 billion. That was the impact of the vultures disappearing in India. And the biggest part of this, of course, was the public health downside. And again, you're just confronted with a kind of economic mindset that sees the diclofenac, quite reasonably perhaps at the time, as being a way of producing more rural incomes to boost wages for people living in the countryside by keeping their animals healthier for longer. Nobody foresaw this massive impact that came with this cascade of effects that accompanied the loss of those birds. Another story that I came across during the research of this part of the book is about an outbreak of West Nile virus in the United States in 2002. West Nile virus is a nasty condition that can kill you. It causes inflammation of the brain, makes you very sick. The outbreak in the United States in the early 2000s killed about 1,000 people, estimated to have cost in the healthcare side alone about $200 million to sort it out. What was very interesting and subsequently emerged as a very fascinating backdrop to that particular period of infections amongst people across the US was how it was very unevenly distributed in terms of where people got West Nile virus and where they didn't. And the researchers that tried to explain this very uneven spread of infections, they looked at everything: household income, how much people traveled, the kind of lifestyle they had, the amount of time they spent outside, the kinds of things that they had in their house that may or may not have helped the mosquito to find them through different things they had planted in the garden or whatever it would be. They accounted for all of that. And the one thing that they could find that correlated with the distribution of the disease was wild bird diversity, would you believe? In those places where there were lower infections, there was a greater diversity of wild birds. And the reason this explained, or helped to explain, the distribution of the illness was because the mosquito that transmits West Nile virus to people, it's an avian specialist. It would feed on birds before it would feed on people. So when there's more birds, the mosquitoes will feed on them. When there's no birds, the mosquitoes are forced to feed on people. So there's a buffering, a dilution effect going on that was helping to keep the disease away from humans because of the availability of an alternative food source. This is a fascinating finding, and I wonder how many people who are looking at public health priorities in different parts of the world are thinking about these kinds of things and the contribution being made by nature. And one of the things that emerges from that study in the US is if you're interested in being able to control future outbreaks of West Nile virus, it would be sensible to keep the stream sides wild and with big trees in the city parks, to have areas of wetland, of woodland and grassland that would encourage the maximum diversity of birds near to where people live. That would be the logical implication of that. And I don't think anyone's yet done the economics to work out how much that costs compared to picking up the pieces of people being sick. But I think it's an interesting finding nonetheless, and one that maybe should be fed into the way in which these kinds of things are thought about in the future. And then another bit of this relationship thing concerns pest control. I mentioned the overuse of pesticides a moment ago. Since the 1940s, we've become very used in agriculture to seeing a big part of the way in which we continue to grow yields year on year is ever more exotic chemicals to kill wild creatures. Very rarely do we look at the possible allies we might have in the natural world in being able to do the same job for less cost and with much less collateral damage. There's quite a few studies emerging in different parts of the world now which gives an impression of the potential of this. There's one I talk about in here by a couple of Dutch researchers who, over a period of years, looked at the effects of songbirds feeding on caterpillars in apple orchards in the spring. Probably all of you have seen a great tit, the little bird so big, green, yellow, black and white, handsome little creatures, voracious insectivores. They very much favour caterpillars in the springtime when they're feeding their babies. And if you have these things feeding in an apple orchard during the early part of the year, you can expect that some effect might be occurring as a result of these birds feeding on the caterpillars that otherwise would damage the fruit. So the researchers who tried to quantify this, basically what they did was put some nest boxes in one half of the orchard to encourage the great tits in, and in the other half of the orchard they netted it with mist nets to keep the birds out, but the moths that laid the eggs that hatched out into caterpillars could get in. So they basically had an experiment that controlled for the effect of the birds. Birds present, birds absent, everything else being equal. Cut a long story short, what they found at the end of the growing season was that in the area where the birds were present and feeding their babies during that critical period when the fruit was being set, they had 50% more high-quality fruit from that side of the orchard compared to the bit where the birds were excluded. This is maybe common sense at one level, but quantifying it like that really does help to get some sense of the economic value being provided by organisms like that at certain times of the year and in certain contexts. And if you think about that for a second in terms of the 50% of the fruit harvest, that is a massive proportion. How many policymakers, when they're looking at the approval for new pesticides, are thinking about the downsides that could come with these things? There's not only birds that suffer from this kind of chemical. As you heard a second ago in China, you can wipe out the pollinators at the same time as you're hitting the pests, and also you can be wiping out beneficial insects like lacewings, ladybirds, various species of earwig, all of which are very important predators of pests in agricultural landscapes. And this is not to say that we have to go back to some kind of organic farming system where chemicals are banned, but I do think what we now know from some of the research going on in different parts of the world, that actually there's a huge opportunity to be able to do more working with nature at the same time as being able to rely less on expensive chemicals, at the same time as enhancing other values that we need, not least to be looking after the pollinators that help the food production as well. Food, pest control, disease control, biomimicry, carbon storage, all very important. This is even more important though, isn't it? Fresh water. Without this, our society would last 2 days, maybe less. Take it so much for granted. This probably came out of a tap, didn't it? We increasingly get water out of bottles as well. And I suppose for most of us, that's the end of the story, isn't it? You kind of flip the lever on the sink, the water flows out, and you undo the bottle. And very rarely do we think about the backstory behind this. And I suppose some of us think, well, probably a reservoir or something, or some groundwater that we've abstracted this material from. But of course, there's a whole other layer of this going back out to some really quite fundamental aspects of how our whole system works. Because in the end, this is rainwater, and the rainwater is coming from these big fluffy structures that we see flying over our head out there. And those big fluffy structures, of course, are in turn being produced by evaporation over water bodies, most of them over the oceans. And that 2/3 of the Earth's surface that is covered with salt water is the ultimate source of the fresh water, and the reason it continues to be recycled in the way that it is because of evaporation by the sun, our home star hitting that blue surface, driving off water into the atmosphere and then forming clouds. But the key piece that some people have been looking at recently, which is really quite interesting in terms of how we can continue to restore our fresh water, is the bit between the evaporation and the cloud formation. Because if you look at the way in which cloud forms, it forms much more readily and much more rapidly if there are tiny particles in the atmosphere which seed the droplets to come together and to coalesce into these big white formations. Now, if you look at the amount of dust in the Earth's atmosphere that could be explaining the amount of cloud we get every day, the cloud formed on the Earth every day is absolutely massive in terms of the quantity. But if you look at the amount of dust being kicked up from, for example, desert storms and dust storms putting little tiny bits of silt into the air, or some of the salt sprays that's coming off the tops of waves, also putting tiny particles into the air, if you look at these kinds of sources, they're insufficient to explain the amount of cloud we get. There's another source of particles which lie behind this cloud formation. And scientists are beginning to think that the principal source of this is a group of plankton called the coccolithophores. And these plankton drift in numberless trillions in the surface of the ocean. They're photosynthetic, and so they're using sunshine to be able to produce complex molecules to grow and to reproduce. But a byproduct of their metabolism is a gas called dimethyl sulfide. And this is they release from their biological activity. And when that gets into the atmosphere, it unites with oxygen and it forms little sulfate particles. And that is increasingly believed to be why we get so much cloud on the Earth every day. It's basically a plankton-driven system. And so that plankton is helping the water to be recycled, because once that falls down, hopefully later on as rain, obviously it will spend some time in the terrestrial environment, either going through a tree or going into the groundwater, going through a reservoir, coming into our homes, going back out as sewage, but in the end, it all finishes up basically back down in the sea. And so that replenishment of the fresh water, of course, is vital. I've got no idea how many times this has been recycled since it first fell on the Earth as a comet about 4 billion years ago, but it's probably been through the digestive system of a dinosaur a few times, and being here in London might have been through each of us actually a couple of times as well, who knows. But the point is that it's being recycled, and it's not being recycled in a way which we should really take for granted. And I'll mention something maybe about those coccolithophores later on in terms of the system that sustains those plankton. But of course, it's not just for the fact of rain clouds that we can have fresh water. It's also down to the systems that intercept it when it falls on the ground. A lot of the water that we get in this country comes out of groundwater. That's being replenished through healthy soils. If you have damaged soils that are either compacted or which have washed away altogether, the water runs off and it doesn't replenish the groundwater, and over time you have a water security issue following that. We also have a great deal of benefit we're getting from woodlands and wetlands and peat bogs in this country and elsewhere as a result of the sediments being trapped before we get to treatment works, which makes our water much cheaper than it would otherwise be. And then you can see a role of different ecosystems in different parts of the world in being able to ensure water security in dry seasons. There's a group of ecosystems across the subtropical parts of the world. If any of you have ever been to Tenerife or to Gran Canaria, you might have seen these ecosystems. They're called cloud forests, and they occur at about 2,000 meters above sea level. And these are vital elements of water security for a whole range of very fast emerging countries, Vietnam, Mexico, West African countries amongst them. Because these systems, not only do they store water, but they actually harvest it from cloud, hence the name cloud forest. You go up to one of these places, and the one on Tenerife is a good one to visit, holiday destination, obviously. If you go up into the mountain, you can see for yourself how these things work. They're basically forests dominated by trees, obviously, but absolutely smothered in lichens, in mosses, in ferns, and the leaf area of the trees themselves means that when the cloud, which bubbles up every day over the ocean, hits the side of the mountain at this particular altitude, basically the moisture gets stripped out by this great mass of vegetation. And because it's quite cool at about 2,000 meters, you get something like a meter or two of leaf litter accumulating under the trees as the leaves fall down. And that acts like a massive sponge, holding the water in the environment and then feeding streams. And if you go to different parts of the world, you find that in some regions that have a very strong wet and dry season, the only reason the rivers are continuing to run in the dry season is because the cloud forests are harvesting water from clouds. It's not raining, but by doing that job and replenishing the groundwater, the rivers continue to run throughout the year. And the city of Dar es Salaam is a good example, Tanzania's industrial powerhouse. It's being basically fueled in terms of its water supply by cloud forests in the mountains, the Uluguru Mountains, some several hundred kilometers away. And of course, countries have seen those kinds of ecosystems as places to get timber, places to plant coffee, places to open up agriculture, places to rear goats. And as a result of that, the service that these things are providing is going down. And if you think about any country in the world in terms of what ultimately is behind its security and its economic growth, without water, it's nowhere. So nature is what gives us water, nothing else, despite the bills we get from the water utilities like Thames and others. At the end of the day, their business is without any foundation at all if it doesn't have these services being provided free by nature, whether it's the plankton in the ocean, healthy soils filtering the water, or it being held into the environment by different elements of natural systems. And then, of course, there's the salt water, which is nearly all of it. Would you believe on the Earth only 0.3% of the water is fresh, and nearly all of that is locked up in the glaciers? So the other bit is nearly all salt water. And that salt water, of course, is also delivering quite a few benefits to us. And I suppose the obvious one, which you can quantify in economic terms, is marine fisheries. We take annually at the moment about 90 million tonnes of fish out of the sea every year globally. And as a result of the businesses which are relying on this, whether they be fishing boats going to sea, marine engineers who are building them and maintaining them, the retailers and the suppliers and the processors and the people who are fixing all the equipment and manufacturing the equipment, put all that together, and this is worth about $278 billion per year in GDP, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Also happens to be a very big employer, about 100 million people employed in fishing in different parts of the world. And also, would you believe, for nearly half of humanity, 3 billion people, fish is the main protein source. And most of it is still coming from wild fisheries in the oceans. And these things are self-sustaining. Unlike a field of potatoes, you don't need to go and plant new potatoes. You just go out and catch new fish that's been replenished through this solar-powered, plankton-fueled ecosystem that I mentioned a second ago, which is also creating this dimethyl sulfide gas, which is helping the water cycle to function. So the fish are being self-replenished, and at the same time as the fish are being self-replenished through a food chain that starts with plankton, bear in mind that those same plankton that are helping to make it rain are also sucking in about 40% of the carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere from fossil fuels every year. And just take a breath in. At least 50% of the air I just sniffed in then, and you're sniffing in now, was actually put there by those very same photosynthetic plankton drifting in the surface of the ocean. We get a certain amount of oxygen replenishment, free oxygen put back into the air by terrestrial plants, but the bulk of it is coming from tiny unicellular organisms drifting in the surface of the ocean. And you may think to yourself, well, actually, thank God we can rely on the plankton, even if we are trashing things on land. Surely there's nothing we can do to the vast expanses of sea that's going to undermine these jobs being done by these tiny plants. But unfortunately, there is a big threat there, and it's in the form of what many people call the other CO2 problem. I guess most of us have heard the science now about climate change and the warming of the atmosphere that's being progressed through the build-up of carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide and everything else. The other thing we hear less about, but which is a threat to the very fundamental bits of the ocean system, is acidification of the seas being caused by the build-up of carbonic acid, which is basically through the absorption of CO2. The more CO2 we put up, the more acid the oceans will get. And the acidity is a particular threat to shell-forming organisms. And that's exactly what those coccolithophores are, those tiny microscopic organisms that are helping to make it rain and which are helping to suck in carbon and release CO2. Their shell forming depends upon a certain pH in the ocean. If it gets too low, if it gets too acidic, they cease to function. That, I think, is something that we should be very careful to understand as we pump even more CO2 into the air as a result of the way in which we're treating the land, deforesting, and of course burning fossil fuels. And around the edge of the oceans, too, we can see a huge number of benefits that we're deriving from different ecosystems. And looking at some of the evidence that we have to hand over the beneficial effects of systems like coral reefs and mangroves in protecting coastal areas, a fast-growing body of literature telling us that the most cost-effective way in which we can defend areas of coast that are going to be vulnerable to the kinds of impacts that we can expect with climate change, more extreme storms, hurricanes and so on, the best thing we can do to be able to withstand the effects of this is to look after natural systems in coastal areas. There's a lot of examples in what has nature ever done for us, but I guess the one that illustrates the point the best is what happened to New Orleans back in 2005 with the impact of Hurricane Katrina. Don't know if any of you remember that, this monster storm coming through the Gulf of Mexico. What you didn't hear about probably was another storm coming about 3 weeks later called Hurricane Rita, which made landfall in Texas, about 300 kilometers to the west. Hurricane Rita was also a Category 5 storm, an absolute monster, humdinger of a hurricane, but it didn't get the same headlines because it didn't do the same kind of damage. And the reason it didn't do the same kind of damage is largely down to the state of the coastal wetlands where these two things made landfall. Hurricane Katrina came across degraded wetlands where large saltwater canals had been cut into the coastal marshes, penetrating seawater far inland, killing the natural forests that were on the landward side of the coastal marshes. Where Hurricane Rita came ashore, the coastal wetlands were intact and provided what the authors of this particular piece of work called horizontal levees. And so the human tendency is to build high walls, nature tendency is to have a big flat expanse, and the big flat expanse of coastal wetland is very, very good in taking the power out of a storm or indeed a tsunami wave before it makes contact with people and property. And the benefit of ecosystems like coral reefs, coastal marshes, and mangroves is that they're self-adjusting. As the sea level goes up, they accumulate sediments and they go up as well, requiring us to do very little indeed. And there was a piece of work done by the World Resources Institute and the World Wildlife Fund a few years back, looking at the value of these kinds of coastal systems in one country, the country of Belize in Central America, where they established or estimated, and again these are conservative numbers they used, estimated the value of that country's coastal barrier reef and its mangroves to be in the order of a quarter of the country's GDP. And the reason they came to such a high figure was because, first of all, those two systems were replenishing a lot of fisheries. So the big ocean fish that people were catching, either for sport or for food, were actually laying their eggs in the coral reef and in the mangroves. There was a load of tourist revenue coming into the country, people going diving and bird watching. But the big thing, the really big ticket, was the cost of removing those two systems and replacing them with concrete coastal defences. It would have been an eye-watering sum that the country simply couldn't afford. And so once you start to dig into these kinds of things and you start to look at coastal areas around the world, which for many policymakers look like wasteland, these areas of barren marsh with birds flying over them, they look like the kind of place you probably want to build a factory or a port, and if you've got a nice area of coral reef, probably you want to build a hotel there. Once you start to get these kinds of numbers on the table, however, you can ask some very searching questions about the wisdom of all of that from the point of view of the economic benefits we get. And actually a piece of work that we did with the International Sustainability Unit a couple of years back, looking at the economics of the Thai prawn industry, showed us very clearly that once you start to look at coastal defences, the capture of carbon, and the vulnerability that comes with draining these areas, you soon realise that actually it's a big economic loss that's coming with that kind of industry, rather than the economic gain that you'd be fooled into believing is being achieved if you looked at the simple numbers being produced by the companies who are selling these prawns into Western markets and elsewhere. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of material and information out there now which tells us that nature's value is absolutely massive from an economic point of view. Some of the numbers you can put on this are speculative, but the thing I would say about that is actually that nature's value is not nothing. And that, frankly, is the problem that we have now. If you look at the decisions being made by governments to clear coastal marshes, to open up areas of forest, to drain wetlands, the assumption behind all of that is that nature's value is worthless. And so long as we argue that nature is beautiful against hard economic numbers, I fear that we will continue to lose. If, however, we start to put our own numbers on the table and say, actually, this is the economic costs of destroying a forest or a wetland, the insecurity we create in relation to water and food, and the economic costs of that, then I think a different kind of conversation will break out. But this does mean a mindset change is needed, and getting out of the trap that we now find ourselves in, where we see this idea of balance as the job of protecting the environment, rather than protecting the environment and in order to keep the economy going. And this is why I'm quite keen on the idea of a phrase that goes by the words of natural capital. I don't know if any of you have heard the idea of natural capital. The idea of natural capital is to make a parallel with financial capital. So if you had some savings and you put them in a bank or in some kind of investment fund, you would hope to get some kind of a return. You'd put your money in and maybe you get 2 or 3% a year back, and you're pretty happy about that because your capital has remained intact and you're earning a bit of a dividend, and if you're pretty wealthy, maybe you could live on that and your capital remains your security. Natural capital, by the same logic, would be protected in order that we get a dividend each year. So we might want to protect the oceans in order to maintain that carbon service that's being provided there and to maintain the service being provided in terms of oxygen being replenished back into the air. And we might want to retain the capital of fish stocks so that we can continue to get millions of tons of fish each year. And of course, what happens when you blow the capital is you go bankrupt, and it's very clear in a financial sense when this happens, you're out of money and you have an unpleasant set of consequences that follow. We've not yet made the same connection with natural capital and understood that the more we deplete the Earth's assets of wetlands, of forests, of biodiversity, of carbon capture services, the more we imperil our future economic well-being. And actually, the idea of natural capital, I think, is particularly powerful when you look at what happens when you have abuses of financial capital. Who remembers Bernie Madoff? Do you remember Bernie Madoff? The man with the massive so-called Ponzi scheme. He was basically running a fraudulent financial structure whereby he was claiming that the capital he was investing was generating a return. He wasn't doing that at all. He was taking new investments and paying it to previous investments as interest. It wasn't interest. The only way he could keep this structure going was to fraud more and more people, to fool more and more people till the thing got so massive it ultimately collapsed. And that's what happened in 2009 when Bernie Madoff was exposed as having defrauded people out of literally tens of billions of dollars by claiming to be doing investments when in fact what he was doing was blowing the capital. And that's exactly what's going on with natural capital. As we destroy the Earth's natural diversity and degrade its ecosystems, we're basically engaged in a planet-scale Ponzi scheme. The difference between the planet Ponzi and the one run by Bernie Madoff, however, is that Bernie Madoff got 500 years in jail, whereas people engaged in the planet-scale Ponzi get knighthoods and bonuses. Thanks very much indeed.